I think critical Buddhism, in a narrow sense, refers to the work of Hakamaya Noriaki and Matsumoto Shiro, two professors at Komazawa University who in the 1980s, late 1980s, early 1990s, published a series of very polemical articles saying Taratagarbha idea is not Buddhism, or original enlightenment is not Buddhism, Buddha nature is not Buddhism. And
Zen is not Buddhism.
Zen is not Buddhism. And the reasoning for that was reacting to the Japanese situation, I think, and the history of Japanese Buddhism, in which the idea of original enlightenment or everyone is enlightened just became standard, unchallenged assumption. And then it kind of spread from there. A lot of Western scholars picked up on what they were saying and developed in their own way. People like Dan Lusthaus, he thought, oh, this is what I've been trying to say with my studies with Yogacara. Other people kind of, I think, like the idea, the controversial Zen is not Buddhism type idea, or that, it kind of gave him a handle to criticize kind of unspoken assumptions in American or European Buddhism.
For me too, the context is important for me, and there's a lot of, it's very interesting to me, the context. So kind of like you just said about Dan Lusthaus, for myself, when I arrived at Madison to do my graduate work, back in those days, Madison was pretty much the place to go. And my own trajectory of involvement in things Buddhist and Buddhist studies, from Japan and kind of a Zen world on through and ending up in Dharamsala and kind of a Gelugpa way of looking at things, I was really attracted to all of that. And then I ran into Gelugpa Hana through one of our graduate students, Rodney Horikawa. And, Gelugpa Hana had a very strident, polemical view about Buddhism and what it really was, and certainly what it wasn't. And it certainly wasn't anything, or it wasn't a whole lot of what the Mahayana was about. And at Wisconsin, I made a couple of notes about this kind of Wisconsin context. And so, at the University of Wisconsin, when I got there, Buddha nature was an extremely common topic. It was so common that you could guarantee that it would be a prelim question. We had these 3-ring binders of prelim questions that we would pass around, like the kirigami, the secret lore. And there were so we had 20 different answers on, is Buddha nature the same as Atman, Hindu Atman, right? Another one was, is Bhakti the same as Pure Land? There were a lot of standard questions, right? And so it was definitely, it was in the air. And the group at Wisconsin at that time, this was not anywhere. I don't think you could have made it at Wisconsin. This was not an ineffable, mystical way of understanding Buddhism. The people that were there, the people we studied with, Keith Yandell was a professor of the philosophy of religion, and he was a hardcore Anglo-analytic kind of philosopher. You had to be able to say things and defend them. And the other people, that Paul Griffiths, who was there, was another philosophical thinker, and he was there. And he went on, in his apologetics is also very much along these kinds of lines. And Jose, writing about scholasticism, the idea that scholasticism is a category of Buddhism was anathema to a whole lot of Buddhists at the time, who thought that the point of Buddhism was to rid your mind of all thoughts, and thinking was the enemy, and all of this kind of stuff. And other folks too, Roger Jackson, who went on later with John McCransky and did sort of an engaged, I don't know, what did they call it, constructive Buddhism, right? And at the same time, theory and criticism was also in the air in the academy in general. The idea that we weren't just objective scholars studying something, and especially if we were Buddhist, if we had Buddhist commitments and we were academics, all of these things were now sort of allowed in the air, and kind of the postmodern denial of objectivity. The idea that there was some scientific thing that we were studying there, and the fact that the academy was political. Foucault and power and these things we weren't innocent out there. And so critical Buddhism very strongly shares this idea that we are not innocents. and that we are smuggling our metaphysical commitments in our supposed academic things. Hakamaya's one of my favorite rants of his was, I go to a conference and I hold up my Xerox copies of Sanskrit manuscripts and everybody thinks I'm a god. But when I go up there and I tell them what I actually think and believe, they call it demagoguery. And that was a very kind of strong statement. And so Critical Buddhism shares this kind of distrust of the pretense of the objective scholar with a lot of that. And other kinds of contexts of it. At the time, Ronald Reagan was the president. Nakasone in Japan was the president, and fears of the resurgence of Japanese right-wing stuff was very much in the air, just as the religious right was a concern over here. And again, they were afraid of, again, in Japan, this was the time of Aum Shinrikyo, the Aum sarin gas bombing stuff, right? So they were very much afraid of the authoritarian possibilities of a non-critical, ineffable, you can't say anything about it, understanding of what truth was. To them, that leads to the authoritarianism that cannot be criticized and has to be just guru worshipped and can lead to all sorts of complicated stuff, authoritarianism. And so all of those things kind of came together. And when I think of the cohort at Wisconsin at that time, everybody that came out of that kind of shares that sort of critical stance regardless of...
Well, it was a fortuitous coming together of a number of people. Jamie and I were graduate students, and Hakamaya came to Wisconsin from Komazari University on a one-year sabbatical, and
Takasaki was there too.
Yeah,
right?
Takasaki came, and he offered to do a course. And we got together once a week to compare the Chinese, Sanskrit, Tibetan, and all the commentaries of the Mahayana Samgraha, the chapter 10, right? And so it was a mix of people, Prographists, John Keenan, Jamie and I, Hanshin from Taiwan. Did you ever come? I don't know.
You were at Sarah at the time.
Yeah. And it was the first time for me to have that kind of spread of, it was a very detailed textual analysis and comparison of across different languages. So the seminar itself was very technical and textual oriented. But the most fun was after the seminar, we'd go out and, for tacos and beer, and for 2-3 hours argue about, Buddha nature and all these other things. And Hakamaya, I think that he was just developing these sort of critical ideas. And as soon as he went back to Japan, he started publishing all these very polemical things. And I think before that, he was kind of afraid to come out and say, well, Zen is not Buddhism, or Tathagata is not Buddhism. But then, it was, bam, all of a sudden it was
there
out
was
there.
A fearful conference at Wisconsin, and Takasaki, Kyoto ran this conference, all these Japanese scholars and Western scholars, and there was one session that went till 3 or 4 in the morning, and it was screaming and filled with tears, and Hakamaya, as a junior kind of guy at that time, was raked over the coals by Takasaki and Nagao and all these big shots. And at the same time this was going on, largely through the Nanzan Institute folks, Jim Heisig and some of the other folks, books were starting to come out in Japan. This was the beginning of Zen at War, Brian Victoria's Zen at War, and from Nanzan, Rude Awakenings, Buddhism in the War. And so it was starting to come out at that same time about the Japanese, just call it the establishment, the Buddhist, the religious establishment. But
Bob Scharf's Zen and Nationalism.
Zen and Japanese, and the art of nationalism. Art of nationalism. So, the criticism of the Japanese Buddhist establishment's involvement in ultranationalism and militarism, along with, as I said, Nakasone, and this is called Nihon Jinron, the theory of Japanese uniqueness, was all starting to get people a little bit freaked out about, what this was about. And so, if the waving the papers and demagoguery is my favorite Hakamaya quote, I think my favorite Matsumoto quote is, we Japanese aren't just sitting around staring mystically vacant-eyed at flowers and rock gardens all day. we Japanese Buddhists think about stuff just like you do. And so, the idea that Buddhism was not just this kind of anti-intellectual vacating the mind, tied in with social ideas about authoritarianism and the emerging story of Japanese Buddhist establishments' role in social discrimination, militarism, and things like that. And it kind of all coalesced, interestingly.
Yeah, and how words and concepts are important. It's not just, sitting and, you said, like emptying your mind and denying, kind of denying the value of texts as ideas or words.